Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Our mission here is simple. Take a mountain of information articles, research your notes, and find the core insights. We cut through the noise to get you well-informed, fast, all tailored just for you.
And today we're diving into a really interesting stack. We've got recent news reports focusing on political events and reactions, detailed analysis on the federal budget and economic projections, and some surprising data points on demographic shifts across the U.S.
Think of this deep dive as your shortcut to understanding some of the most complex, interconnected stories shaping the country right now. We're going to pull out the most important facts, highlight surprising connections you might miss looking at these pieces individually, and give you the context to see the bigger picture.
It's quite the journey through this material, yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this stack and start where, well, a lot of the headlines have been recently. The ongoing situation in Los Angeles.
Right, so when you look at the history of major urban unrest, it typically runs its course in about a week. Our sources note that if what's happening in LA were purely a spontaneous response, its duration wouldn't be entirely, outside the norm.
But there's a suggestion in the material we reviewed that this unrest isn't purely organic. One perspective argues it's been largely manufactured for political theater purposes.
And if that's the case, it might help explain why it seems to be continuing longer than you might otherwise expect. What's really fascinating here is the gap between the narrative you might hear and what's reported on the ground.
Exactly. While some portray LA as a hellscape, the observable evidence suggests confrontations have been largely peaceful, relatively few, and confined to a pretty small part of the city.
Yeah, we even heard from readers who live there who reported, minimal impact where they are.
Right, and that brings us to the claim that order was restored thanks to federal forces. But the reality, according to the analysis we have, seems different.
It does. The Marines who were mentioned in some reports apparently haven't actually been deployed for this mission. They're reportedly undergoing additional training.
Yeah.
The National Guard was deployed, around 2,000 troops, but their role is limited, described as glorified security guard duty.
And crucially, the material points out that normal order was almost entirely restored before these troops even arrived.
Which is a key point. And that limited role for the troops ties directly back to the fact that the Insurrection Act hasn't been invoked.
Right. For context, this is a rarely used federal law that would allow the president to deploy military troops domestically for law enforcement.
Exactly. And without invoking it, the armed forces deployed have very restricted powers.
So this situation looks less like a full-scale federal takeover to quell unrest, and maybe more like an effort to get the appearance of being tough without taking on the significant risks.
Like the potential political disaster if civilians were harmed, right?
Yeah.
The sources bring up comparisons to historical tragedies like Kent State.
Yeah, it seems like a move calculated, perhaps, for optics more than actual law enforcement action by the military itself.
And on the legal side, Governor Newsom and the California Attorney General did seek an immediate emergency injunction to stop the Trump administration from sending troops.
What happened with that?
Well, a U.S. District Judge, Charles Breyer, heard the arguments but didn't grant the injunction immediately. He gave the administration until Thursday to file briefs, so a decision should be coming soon after that.
Okay. And what about the cost of this deployment?
Ah, yes. The acting comptroller of the Department of Defense estimates it at $134 million.
$134 million. But there was a striking detail highlighted in the sources.
That this estimate somehow doesn't seem to cover basic necessities like food and shelter for the troops.
You're odd.
It is. And that's a point being made visually on social media with images circulating. The material notes that visual evidence can be particularly impactful, in shaping public perception.
So depending on where you get your information, you might be seeing that $134 million cost and thinking about how those tax dollars are being spent.
Or maybe you're seeing images of troops lacking basic supplies. It's quite the contrast.
Okay, so shifting from the specifics on the ground, it's pretty clear this is being actively leveraged in the political arena.
Oh, absolutely. Speaker Mike Johnson, for instance, is using the events in LA to push for the quick passage of what he calls the One Big Beautiful Bill.
Right, framing it as providing essential funding needed to secure our nation's borders and supporting IC agents against illegal aliens and the radical left. Strong language there.
Very. But the analysis we reviewed expresses, quite a bit of skepticism about this push, describing it as hot air.
Why is that?
Well, the skepticism comes from the assessment that there's very little chance the Senate will just quickly ram through a multi-trillion-dollar budget bill because of the current headlines around immigration policy clashes.
Makes sense. By the time the Senate is likely ready to act on a comprehensive budget, the situation on the ground in LA will probably have shifted anyway.
Exactly. Looking at Senate reactions more broadly, though, most Republicans appear to be supporting the administration's actions, which are characterized in the analysis as a pseudo-crackdown.
We saw Senator John Kennedy reportedly said the president had no choice, and Senator John Cornyn felt Trump needs to restore order, claiming plenty of precedent for the National Guard deployment.
Although it's interesting, the sources we looked at described this specific type of National Guard deployment, under these circumstances without the Insurrection Act as unprecedented. So a bit of a clash there on the precedent.
It is. The stack of material also highlighted a few individual senatorial reactions that really stand out. Let's talk about those.
Okay. First, there's Senator Tom Cotton. You might remember about 5 years ago, back in June 2020, he wrote that controversial op-ed arguing for using the military against civilians to restore order.
Right. That caused a huge uproar, led to resignations at the New York Times, I recall.
It did. And what's the takeaway here, according to the analysis? It shows how the Overton window has moved.
Meaning, what was considered outrageous then is less so now.
Pretty much. What was seen as an extreme suggestion 5 years ago, using the military domestically like this, well, something resembling it is actually happening now, with apparently far less public outrage.
Wow.
One source even pointed out that the Wall Street Journal recently ran a slightly updated version of Cotton's original piece without obvious repercussions. It really does highlight a shift in what's deemed acceptable public discourse or action.
Okay, who else? Another notable reaction came from Senator Markwayne Mullin.
Yes. When asked about Governor Newsom, he offered a quote about Newsom sucking at being number one at being a terrible governor.
Which is quite a sentence.
It is. As the material points out, that's pretty convoluted phrasing. The use of multiple negatives arguably means he ended up saying Newsom sucks at being bad.
Implying he's good.
Technically, yeah. It's maybe a minor point, but it does raise an interesting question about clarity, and precision in political communication, especially when you're trying to land a criticism.
Fair enough. Then there's Senator John Fetterman, a Democrat. His comments have sounded, well, somewhat different from the typical Democratic responses.
Yeah, he condemned actions like setting cars on fire and assaulting law enforcement as anarchy and true chaos.
Which is strong language.
It is. The sources speculate a little bit on influences, even mentioning a dinner he had with Steve Bannon. But the main point being made is that framing the situation as anarchy and true chaos might reflect a particular viewpoint that seems a bit at odds with reports suggesting more contained, though still serious, incidents.
One source just noted that anyone calling this anarchy and true chaos probably hasn't seen actual anarchy and chaos.
Oh, yeah. Generally, though, Democrats seem to be taking a stance against both Trump's specific actions and against non-peaceful protest. Governor Newsom has warned that lawbreakers will face full prosecution.
And LA Mayor Karen Bass imposed a curfew.
She did, although it's worth noting that her curfew is in a small downtown area about 10 miles away from where the main violence occurred.
Which leads the sources to wonder about her specific goals. Is it purely for safety? Or maybe also sending a message that the Democratic Party strongly opposes non-peaceful demonstrations?
Could be. The analysis suggests that given her age, she's likely not positioning herself for her next political job in the same way someone like Newsom might be. So her motives could be more centered on governance or just signaling the party's stance.
And speaking of that curfew, there's a practical detail the material flagged.
Oh, yeah.
If it's still in place through Friday, how will it impact traffic for the Dodgers game? The game ends well after the 8 p.m. curfew starts, and the stadium is right near the edge of that zone.
Exiting that area could get pretty complicated for fans. Good point.
Getting back to Governor Newsom for a second, he appears to be actively using this situation, not just for California, but maybe to raise his national profile for a potential 2028 presidential run. The material points to several examples.
Yeah, one example cited is that rather surreal Star Wars-themed video he posted on X. It featured stormtroopers and a computer voice reading his tweet like Emperor Palpatine.
I saw that. One reader even commented that they do a better Palpatine impression.
That's a fun detail from the sources. He also gave an address aiming for a statesman-like tone, quoting Justice Brandeis, urging peaceful protest, and positioning himself as resisting Trump.
But what the sources argue Governor Newsom really wants from the Trump administration is To be arrested.
That's the suggestion. He's reportedly continued to publicly challenge and dare the White House, while the analysis thinks Trump probably won't take the bait.
But with him, you never know.
Exactly. An arrest would become a huge badge of honor for Newsom among his base, right?
Totally. It might even lead to jokes like that old one about Rudy Giuliani. With Newsom, every sentence has 3 parts: a noun, a verb, and my arrest.
Okay, switching gears slightly within this political landscape, Representative LaMonica McIver of New Jersey has actually been arrested and formally indicted.
And this was by an interim U.S. attorney, Alina Habba, who previously worked for Trump.
That's right. Now, federal indictments usually have a very high success rate, often well over 90%. But the analysis we saw suggests this case might be an exception.
Why is that?
Well, several arguments are presented. 1, that the prosecution could be politically motivated. 2, there's a legal question about whether her alleged actions even rise to the level of a federal crime, even for a private citizen. And 3, her status as a member of Congress offers some protection under the speech and debate clause.
So the thinking is the government's odds of getting a conviction aren't that strong.
That's the consensus from the sources. There's even speculation the case might just be quietly dropped after making headlines.
Meanwhile, McIver is expected to use this indictment for fundraising, maybe become a cause célèbre on the left. Could she leverage this into a political promotion like Newsom seems to be trying?
Well, opportunities in New Jersey seem limited right now. Governorship looks locked up, Senate seats aren't open. The sources mention maybe a Democratic cabinet post or even being considered as a ticket-balancing VP candidate.
But her short time in the House, just 9 months, is seen as a pretty weak resume for VP.
Yeah, that's probably fair.
It's also important, I think, to broaden our view beyond just L.A. These largely peaceful anti-ICE protests have spread nationwide, right?
They have, popping up in around 24 cities, including places you might not immediately think of, like Columbus, Dallas, Las Vegas, Louisville, Nashville, San Antonio, San Diego. It's not just concentrated in traditionally liberal areas.
And why is that wider spread relevant?
Because while voters often say they dislike demonstrators, they tend to dislike instability and unrest even more. The analysis observes that blame for instability often falls on the party in power.
Something Lyndon B. Johnson might have had thoughts on, as the source notes.
Indeed. Finally, within this whole climate of political tension and reaction, there is Donald Trump's upcoming birthday parade this Saturday, described in one source as a kind of triumph of the will reenactment.
And nationwide, no King's demonstrations are planned in response, including a big one in D.C.
Right. Trump has reportedly warned of using very heavy force against anyone who disrupts his birthday plans, but, well, the sources recall his approach in L.A. speaking loudly, but maybe carrying what looks like a smaller stick, at least for now.
Okay, let's shift gears completely now, moving from the political events to the details of the federal budget, specifically looking at that one big, beautiful bill act recently passed by the House.
Right. And the core insight from the analysis of this bill, based on the released data, is that despite its framing, it's projected to significantly add to the federal deficit, especially in the near term.
Now, the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, they provide nonpartisan analysis and scoring of legislation, right? Projecting cost and impact.
Exactly. And the CBO scoring of this bill, according to our sources, highlights how many of the supposed spending cuts and revenue increases within it are actually temporary or described as illusory.
Illusory, meaning not real.
Pretty much. The argument presented is that the bill wasn't primarily designed for long-term fiscal responsibility. Instead, the structure seems aimed at maximizing short-term political benefits and giving the appearance of fiscal action, even if the long-term picture looks worse.
The data visuals we looked at were pretty stark, weren't they?
They were. Charts showing projections for huge near-term deficit hikes under current law, and if the changes in this bill were made permanent, the deficit hikes are huge in all years. One chart even had that provocative title, Spendin' Cuts, What Spendin' Cuts?
So the overall forecast based on this analysis, where are we heading?
Towards 8% of GDP full employment deficits. That's a significant level, a really significant level.
And what about tariffs? Do they help?
The sources note that tariffs currently in place could narrow the deficit slightly, but the phrase used was just by a bit. The estimate is still a 7.3% deficit to GDP ratio, even with permanent tariffs.
Wow. So this level of deficit spending, it raises pretty big concerns about the long-term sustainability of U.S. debt levels.
Definitely. And it's compounded by the country's low national savings rate, meaning we're heavily reliant on global capital flows to finance all that debt.
And there's an argument presented that if the U.S. pursues more isolationist trade policies, it could potentially undermine global confidence in U.S. debt.
Which could lead to higher interest rates needed to borrow money.
Exactly.
And higher interest rates directly impact the cost of the debt itself.
Right. The CBO projections shown indicate the net interest burden, basically. The cost of servicing the debt is expected to rise steeply.
In fact, one source even questions whether the CBO's own interest rate projections might be too good to be true, given the path of spending and debt. Yeah. So the takeaway here seems to be that regardless of the political rhetoric, the underlying fiscal picture painted by this analysis is one of significant and potentially unsustainable increases in debt.
Okay. Moving from the national balance sheet to, well, people.
Yeah.
Population dynamics. Our stack also included material on demographic trends, both globally and within the U.S.
Right. Globally, the striking trend noted is declining fertility rates in most developed countries, particularly sharp declines seen in East Asia.
And the projection for China is rapid population decline in the coming decades.
Yeah, quite dramatic. Here in the U.S., migration patterns continue to show the South leading in population growth. Looking at data over the past couple of decades, 2003 to 2024, the South had a year-over-year growth rate of plus 1.4%.
Ahead of the West at plus 1.0%, the Midwest at plus 0.9%, and the Northeast slowest at plus 0.8%.
And drilling down into what drives that growth gives more insight. The South is growing robustly across all components. Natural growth, births minus deaths, domestic migration, meaning people moving from other states, and international migration.
But the Northeast and the West actually show negative net domestic migration.
That's right. More people are moving out of those regions to other states than are moving in. Now, this outward movement is offset by natural growth and international migration, so they still grow overall. But the Northeast has the highest rate of people moving away to other states.
And the Midwest.
Interesting case. It has the lowest rate of natural growth among the regions, but it benefits from both positive domestic migration and international migration.
Okay, now here's where the demographics section got particularly fascinating, I thought. Bringing in correlations with political leanings based on state-level data from 2023 and 2024.
Yeah, this was really interesting. There's a strong positive correlation in R value of 0.75.
Which is quite strong, statistically speaking.
Very strong. Between how Trumpier a state is measured by the 2024 Trump vote share and its total fertility rate.
So the more a state voted for Trump in 2024, the higher its fertility rate tends to be.
Exactly. The average total fertility rate for Trump states was 1.72, compared to 1.49 for Harris states. Put simply, Trumpier the state, higher the fertility.
And there was a strong negative correlation noted too, right? R equals negative 0.80.
Yeah, also very strong, between how Trumpier a state is and the median age at first marriage.
So a negative correlation means as one goes up, the other tends to go down. The more a state voted for Trump,
the lower the median age at first marriage tends to be. The average age for Trump states was 28.4 compared to 30.3 for Harris states. So Trumpier the state, younger the age at first marriage.
These correlations, just based on the data, offer a really compelling, though obviously not causal, look at how demographic and cultural trends seem to align with political divisions across the country.
Absolutely. And this connects back to some of the reader feedback we received specifically about the New Jersey primary.
Right. One reader highlighted what they saw as a disconnect between the current zeitgeist, which they felt wants wholesale change, candidates like, Bernie Sanders, Trump, maybe even Elon Musk.
Right. Those kinds of figures.
And candidates who are more work within the margins, change this program by 5% types.
And that reader's local union chapter, a university professors union, actually endorsed a candidate described as the leftiest and most strident, which sparks some reflection in their notes about, well, the nature of unions or maybe union leaders who are professors.
Interesting. So this perspective, combined with that fertility and marriage data we just discussed, it might hint at deeper cultural or ideological currents influencing both political preferences and these underlying demographic trends across the U.S.
It really might. Okay, so rounding out our look at recent political news, voters in New Jersey did head to the polls for their primary elections. The results were largely as expected.
Yeah, Mikey Sherrill, a Democrat, and Jack Ciattarelli, a Republican, will face off for governor in November. That's set.
Mikey Sherrill's Democratic primary was actually closer than Ciattarelli's Republican contest. She won with 34% against two mayors who got about 20% and 16%.
Which led one source to wonder if New Jersey Democrats tend to prefer representatives over mayors, given how that played out.
Could be. Jack Ciattarelli, on the other hand, won the Republican primary decisively with almost 68%.
But while Schiaparelli's margin was wider, the analysis notes this doesn't necessarily mean he has greater overall enthusiasm heading into the general election compared to Sherrill.
Right. The Democratic primary was just more competitive. Plus, you have to remember, New Jersey is a reliably blue state.
True. Significantly more votes were cast in the Democratic primary, around 800,000, compared to the Republican primary, which was about 450,000.
And Mikey Sherrill is described as a fairly boring moderate. The assessment is this makes her unlikely to turn off Democratic voters, even if she doesn't, ignite huge enthusiasm.
And an unenthusiastic vote counts the same as an enthusiastic one, right?
Yeah, exactly. So Sherrill is presumed to be the favorite, although there isn't any general election polling available just yet.
Now, this will be Schiaparelli's second try for governor. He lost by just 3 points to Phil Murphy last time. Pretty close.
It was. And one argument reviewed suggests Schiaparelli could win this time. He's got greater name recognition now, more experience, and he's facing a non-incumbent.
But the counterpoint.
Well, Phil Murphy, though relatively unpopular, managed to win re-election last time, even while his party held the White House, which is something a New Jersey Democratic governor hadn't done since the LBJ era, apparently.
That's a strong point.
Also, Schiaparelli didn't have to contend with being associated with an unpopular Trump administration during the last election cycle because Trump wasn't in office then. That could be a factor this time around.
We also got some interesting color on the primary from readers in New Jersey. One felt it was a stealth election with low turnout, saw few yard signs, but lots and lots and lots of mailed flyers.
And get this detail from that same reader. None of the flyers came from official campaigns. They were all from independent PAC's political action committees, many with really obscure names.
The reader joked about getting mail from New Jersey Citizens for Wonderfulness.
Huh. It really highlights the huge role of outside money in campaigns now, even at the state level.
Another reader discussed the potential split of the union vote and mentioned their local union, the University Professors One, endorsed the candidate described as the leftiest and most strident, which, again, sparked some interesting thoughts about dynamics within specific unions or maybe professors in leadership roles.
And a final reader described Sherrill as just fine, characterizing her as that work-within-the-margins type politician.
Contrasting her with candidates who seem to tap into that desire for wholesale change we mentioned earlier.
Right. This reader expressed hope that Schiaparelli is similarly mismatched for the current political mood, or maybe that the whole burn-it-all-down sentiment might fade a bit by November.
We'll see. Looking ahead on the political calendar, Virginia has primaries next week, followed by New York City.
Always more material coming in. Never stops.
Wow, okay. We've really covered a lot of ground in this deep dive today, from the complex situation unfolding in Los Angeles and all the layers of political maneuvering around it.
Through Representative McIver's indictment and the ins and outs of the New Jersey primary.
And then into that broad national picture of the federal budget deficit.
Yeah.
And those truly fascinating correlations in U.S. demographic trends.
Our mission, as always, was to extract the most important nuggets from this stack of sources, giving you a clearer, more connected picture of these different stories without feeling, overwhelmed by information overload.
We've seen how specific events connect to national political strategies, how legislative details impact the economy, and how those underlying demographic forces might correlate with political leanings and maybe shape the future.
So what does all this mean for you thinking about the country right now?
Yeah, here's a final provocative thought for you to consider, building on everything we've just explored. Given the sharp political reactions to unrest we've seen, the significant increases projected for the national debt based on recent legislation, and those notable demographic correlations with political alignment, how might the competing visions for the country's future actually grapple with these intertwined economic and social realities?
How does that desire for wholesale change versus work within the margins politics play out against a backdrop of a rising debt burden and these really distinct regional demographic shifts? Something to keep mulling over as you observe the news.